Well, hello. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to just say a couple hello words, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, who is the brains behind your evening tonight, and then Andrew's going to turn it over to Dean. But because this is the first installment of this series of talks about which we're very excited, and even more broadly, maybe the first event this year in a kind of a broader series of sustainability goings on at Robley, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and indoctrinate you. My name is Jeff Ball, and I'm one of the RFs here, one of the resident fellows here in Robley. My wife, Becky Boll, I think just went to pick up our daughter, who said that she didn't have a bike light when she's in high school. But it's a pleasure to have you here. So what I want to do is, I just want to tell you a little bit about why we're here. So we are starting something in Robley that's called the Robley Living Laboratory for Sustainability at Stanford, which is a mouthful. But broadly, it aims to do two things. It aims to turn this building, which is about to be 100 years old and houses 300 students, half of them freshmen, half of them upperclassmen, into what we're calling a living laboratory for sustainability. So in our view, that takes place on two levels. One is it just takes place in terms of the activities in the dorm, the way students live here, trying to make everyone around here more aware of the extent to which they consume natural resources, among other things, and trying to offer ideas for how we might reduce that, how we might reduce our waste of resources. So what it involves is an experiment in living. There is no shortage of activity around sustainability at Stanford. I'm imagining many of you are taking classes having broadly to do with things touching the environment. There are extraordinarily thoughtful people on this campus whose job is to reduce natural resource waste on this campus. There are student groups that are engaged in it. I know some of you whose faces I know are involved in those groups. So this is really designed to be a complement to that in the dorm setting. I want to just tell you quickly a couple of things that are happening in this. So we are having this term 2 seminars in Robley that are being taught in the room right behind us. There's still room, a couple of spaces in each of these seminars. So if any of these is interesting to you, you can see me afterward, and I'll tell you whose email to send a note to. You can also see it on the sheet that's circulating. So one of these seminars is Civil and Environmental Engineering 126A, taught by a professor named Mike Levick. And the goal of this seminar in the fall is to do a rigorous assessment of Robley's environmental footprint. It's called a life cycle assessment, the experts say. And they're going to assess Robley's environmental footprint in terms of its energy production, its water production, its energy use, its water use, its waste production, food consumption, transportation, and come up with a really sophisticated report by the end of the fall term assessing that footprint. And then the winter term version of this class aims to take what that fall term produced and then prioritize steps that can be taken in Robley that actually make economic sense, and then begin undertaking those steps. So for instance, should we change all the light bulbs in this building? Should we put solar panels on the roof of this building? Should we improve the insulation in this building? Should we do none of those things and just ask everyone who lives here to turn their lights off when they walk out of the door? What are the potential environmental impacts at what cost? And this is a kind of rigorous exercise that's going to happen, and then we're going to actually do some of this stuff. The other seminar, and so if you want to take this class, you can be involved in actually conducting those assessments. The other seminar is a very cool seminar having to do with food sustainability. We now have a garden on that side of Robley, which we are going to inaugurate tomorrow with its first planting. It's a very, very neat thing. Has 10 raised beds, and we're going to put a bunch of crops in there. So this is a food sustainability class that's taught by 2 lecturers in Earth Systems, one of whom is in charge of Stanford's food sustainability system for all of Stanford's dining halls, and the other of whom started something called the Feed Collaborative, which I encourage you to look at if you're interested in. In addition to that, we have a bunch of public service opportunities, so sustainability-related public service opportunities that people in the dorm are going to be involved in to the extent that they want to. And we're going to have a number of, the last thing I'll say before we talk about this talk is a bunch of activities in the dorm with an eye toward reducing consumption. The last thing is we're going to have fairly rigorous monitoring of the environmental effectiveness of those things. So wonderful that everyone says they want to live green, great, but does it actually do anything? Does it mean anything? And so we have a PhD student who's going to be helping monitor that with the aid of some undergraduate interns. So that brings me to the talk this evening. So Andrew's going to tell you more about Hard Earth, but the notion here is consistent kind of broadly with the notion of this sustainability initiative at Robley, which is to go beneath the kind of good-bad dichotomy. So are you green or are you not green? If you're green, you're good. If you're not green, you're bad. Well, that's a little too cute. So the whole notion here is to explore the dilemmas around sustainability, the possibilities, but also really the difficulties. What does it mean to try to live more sustainably? And to what extent does everything you do produce an unintended trade-off? And my suspicion is that most things that one does in the area of sustainability produce trade-offs that often we don't think about. But if society is going to do anything toward them on a big scale, we're going to have to think about. So what we want to do with this series is to kind of revel in those dilemmas. And I want to introduce Andrew, Andrew Sontag, who is a graduate student and will tell you a little bit more about himself. You can introduce, yeah? But Andrew has been doing yeoman's work here in doing all sorts of interviewing with graduate students from across Stanford, disciplines across Stanford, to try to bring you, to kind of curate a series of talks by people who have really extraordinary stories to tell about their work and about the impact of their work more broadly. I just want to say one last thing, which is that there have been lots of institutions at Stanford who have been extraordinarily supportive of everything we're doing now at Robley. I won't go through the whole list, but this involves schools at Stanford, academic departments, administrative offices, institutes, all of whom have been really encouraging in many, many ways, without whom we would not be here tonight. And in particular, we're here tonight because of the generosity of the Vice Provost for Graduate Education at Stanford, who has underwritten much of what we're doing here this evening, so we owe them a debt of gratitude. Andrew, you would introduce Dean?
Yeah, definitely. Talk a little bit about the story. So that's all super exciting. Thanks, Jeff, for taking us through what's going on here. Welcome everyone to Hard Earth, talks by Stanford graduate students exploring tough environmental dilemmas. I'm really excited. This is the first time we're offering this seminar, and I think you guys, by being here, will learn a lot about what's actually happening at Stanford, and a lot of things that you might not have thought about around the idea of environmental sustainability. So to give you a sense of what we're going to explore throughout this quarter, we have 4 graduate students coming in to give talks about their research and broader questions about environmental sustainability. I mean, you can look at what's happening here, read a couple of sentences to describe what's in store, but the idea is that there are people from across Stanford, graduate students who are doing amazing work, that you as undergraduates, I assume many of you are undergraduates. If you're a grad student, that's awesome too, welcome, but you should be aware of what's going on. And so if any of these things interest you, there are 2 options for how you can sort of absorb the information. The first is you can enroll in either CE126X or Earth 126X. Can you raise your hand if you're enrolled in one of those 2? Awesome, just so I get a sense. So as Jeff said, my name's Andrew Santa, and I'll be leading these discussions that we'll be having on the off weeks. So every 2 weeks, there'll be a graduate student that will come in and give a talk about their work, their research, and a broader question or dilemma surrounding sustainability. And then on those off weeks, we'll have a discussion that I'll lead to dive into those dilemmas, to really think critically and thoughtfully about those dilemmas, and have a discussion as a group in which we can explore some of the options for how we can move forward, or explore what possible problems were brought up in the previous week's talk. So that will be really interesting. Space is limited. I think there are 12 students enrolled right now out of 15, so if you're interested in taking that course, definitely be sure to sign up soon, and there is still a little bit of room. The second option is just to come to any of the bi-weekly talks. These are going to be open to anyone within the Stanford community, and we welcome you to come and check them out, especially if one of those talks seemed interesting to you. I just want to note sort of the way in which we've crafted these talks, and think about how they're interesting and relevant to all of you sitting in this audience. One is, as Jeff mentioned, solving environmental sustainability, or even thinking about it, requires a lot of trade-offs and dilemmas. So I have the sort of balance up here. any decision you make has unintended consequences. Any thought, any engineering decision, or any research, there are dilemmas that you have to explore. And so we want to introduce these to you. It's so much more than just designing the most efficient solar panel. There are disciplines, beyond engineering and physics, such as anthropology, that study environmental sustainability. And we think that's an important thing to note, and you will learn a lot just by coming to these lectures and hearing about what people from across the university and different departments are doing. The second is that at Stanford, we're actually solving or thinking about these problems, right? Stanford's an amazing institution at the forefront of environmental sustainability, and you can learn from the departments and the graduate students here about these amazing research efforts that are happening. And so the idea is to introduce some dilemmas that you may not have thought about, and also connect you to Stanford research and Stanford graduate students, and maybe inspire you to become a PhD student one day, if you're interested. If you're in the course, I'll tell you more about myself later. Tonight's not about me, it's about who I'm about to introduce, which is Dean Chahim, I'm sorry. So Dean is a third-year PhD student in the Anthropology department, where he studies engineers and infrastructure projects. At Stanford, before coming to Stanford, Dean earned his undergraduate degrees in environmental engineering and international development at the University of Washington. He then worked professionally as an environmental engineer in Seattle, and additionally has worked on international development projects in South America. At Stanford, his research is broadly aimed at understanding the social context of engineering and the complex dynamics of infrastructures used to control the natural and built environments. Dean's research investigates how we have come to believe in the overwhelming power of technology to resolve environmental crises, and it investigates whether or not that faith is misplaced. His work tells a story of how engineers and their massive feats of engineering can sometimes imperil the sustainable futures they're set to promote. So please join me in welcoming Dean.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew and Jeff. I'm just going to pull this up so I have. Okay. 1 second. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So, thanks guys again for coming, and this is a really big turnout, and I think it's a really exciting initiative that you guys are working on. So, as Jeff said, and as Andrew just explained, the big question I'm trying to deal with tonight, the big dilemma is something that's pretty popular in Silicon Valley. It's thinking about what is the role of technology in solving environmental problems. Will technology, just wipe away all of the environmental damage we've done and bring us to sustainability? There's a lot of people in Silicon Valley that would say, yeah. A lot of people even on this campus that might say yes. Now, what I'm hoping is that, by sharing a little bit of how I become skeptical of that, we can start a critical conversation about what is the role of technology and how can we fit that into a program for sustainability. So, to give you a little bit of background, to give a little bit of background, I studied environmental engineering, and right after I graduated, I worked as an environmental engineer doing sort of remediation projects, which means theoretically cleaning up the environment. And, it kind of felt like a great job. I was saying, okay, here I am on the front lines of the fight against, environmental contamination, using my technology to fix things. But pretty quickly I realized that most of the professional practice of environmental remediation is picking dirt up from one place, putting it somewhere else. Or picking dirt up from one place and spreading it out somewhere else so that it's diluted enough to no longer be a threat to human health. Now, if your idea of cleaning up is putting something on a barge and sending it to Oregon, well, that's fine. But that was not my idea of fixing the environment. And I pretty quickly realized that what I was doing was, while helpful in the short term, potentially actually dangerous in the sense that it was obscuring the idea of the actual problem, which was the production of contamination. We kept on producing more contaminated waste. I'd be sitting on a river taking a sample, in the mud of this dirty, gross oil Superfund site, and across the river is another barge moving back with more oil coming into Seattle. And I said, well, what's really going on here? What is the role of technology then? Is technology actually obscuring some of the problems, or is it actually helping us solve them? And I realized that people aren't, the engineers that I was working with weren't really equipped to actually think about these issues. I wasn't equipped to think about these issues, and that's what actually led me back to graduate school. And my goal today is then to help you guys come to understand a little bit about the politics of technology, how it is that technologies tend to often reflect the power relations that sort of in our society, cultural norms in our society. And if we don't do anything to be a little bit skeptical of them, might actually end up reinforcing those same cultural norms and relationships of power, actually reinforcing the problems that they're supposed to address. And right now, there are many well-intentioned technologies that can kind of serve as your useful stopgaps and adaptations to the situation we have. But if we're not careful, they might actually end up perpetuating those very same problems and even making them worse. So I want to start with an example from my own fieldwork in Mexico City. So here we go. So there's two different computers here. So Mexico City, as many of you guys may know, is one of the biggest urban conglomerations in the world. It has been like that since about 1519. And with 22 million people sitting on this high mountain basin, to give you a sense of when I actually went there the first time, I went to the top of one of the main skyscrapers in the city, and I just ordered dessert because I couldn't really afford to actually sit down at the real restaurant. And looking out over the sunset, over the city, in every single direction you see this. It's just constant city. It does not end until the horizon. And it's something that I had never seen. I mean, growing up in Seattle, I thought I was a city person, but I went there and I realized, well, I'm actually from a small town. So what I didn't know then, and I learned later, is that the city is also in the midst of a massive water crisis. And the aquifers that it has are literally set to run dry by the end of the century. Aquifers is that's where all the water is under our feet. That's when you drill a well and you bring water out, that's coming from an aquifer. And the irony of the city's water crisis is that the people who are most suffering, who actually don't have water and get water out of these tanker trucks, these kind of pretty dirty water, generally speaking, they're also the ones being flooded by water during the rainy season. Sewage enters their house, they have to take out all the possessions, take out all their couches, it's a real mess. And so, it doesn't really make sense at first. You say, well, hold on, how can you have so much water that you get flooded and then not enough water to drink? So to solve this problem, engineers now are working on this massive tunnel. It's called the Túnel Emisor Oriente, this sort of giant drainage tunnel. And on Reddit, when I was looking for images for this, it showed up as Latin America's largest sewer. I mean, that's more or less what it is. This is a tunnel that will go out and more than 50 kilometers and take water out of the watershed, and theoretically solving the flooding problem. But how do we get to this point? How do we get to the point where you have both too much water and too little water at the same time in the same place? To understand this, we have to look a little bit at the hydrology, and we also have to look at the history. So, just reminding you guys where Mexico City is, you're up in this high mountain plain. And Mexico City, what you guys may not realize, is actually originally a bunch of lakes. So this is the indigenous city of Tenochtitlan, and it was this beautiful system of causeways, sort of Venetian. When the Spanish conquistadors came and colonized the place, they were actually blown away. They had never seen anything like this in their lives. Now, the interesting thing from the hydrology standpoint is that this is an endorheic basin, which means basically the only way water comes in and out is through the sky and through the ground. So I want you guys to imagine for a second that we are the Valley of Mexico right here. So take out the roof, and you have this open sky, and beneath your feet you have a bunch of sponges. That's the soil, and you guys are the city. So if you to think about what happens when it rains, the sponges fill up with water, and then eventually, once they're fully saturated, the water just starts to pool on the bottom, and your feet start getting wet. Then things start. It's either the start of a lake, if it's in natural conditions, or the start of a flood, if you actually have buildings there. And we'll come back to this sponge and analogy, but the whole city is surrounded by mountains, so there's no way for the water to go in and out. That means there's no rivers. The rivers just come down from the mountainside, but they don't leave. So the only way out for the Spanish was actually to bust open a hole. So they found this system very bizarre. They had come from Europe, where most valleys had drains. They had rivers that exited the valley. So they said, okay, look, you know what we're going to do? We're worried about flooding. We keep on getting flooded. We're going to actually bust a hole. So they imagine you just kick the door open right here. I'm not going to do that because it's probably an emergency exit. And they put a canal through, and that was the first of these massive engineering projects that were done in Mexico City. Now, this was actually considered by the Spanish as a kind of restoration project, restoring the basin to a natural system, which has a big drain. We would probably not consider that the restoration project today, but you have to understand that the concept of what is sustainable, what is natural, change over time. Now, it didn't really work. the reality is that the floods continued. And then in 1900, with the independent Mexican state, they decided, okay, we got so many floods, we need to do something about it, so they built an even bigger canal. Now, they're starting to hear a pattern. That's the point. So these are these big lakes that, going back, you can see how big it was before. It starts to become drained with these big canals that are taking water out of the watershed. Now, that didn't really work that well either, unfortunately, and so by 1950, the city was almost completely urbanized. Those big canals that I just mentioned, meant that the water under your feet was now gone. For the most part, there were no lakes left. There was still flooding, though. That was because enough water comes, and the thing about flooding that's kind of interesting is that the more a city grows, the more you end up with a flooding problem. Because if you cover all those sponges with a bunch of concrete, well, what happens to the water? It has to go through the other sponges that are still open. And then if you cover up the entire thing, suddenly you have no place for the water to go. And that's what was happening in Mexico City as the city started to grow. The flooding problem kept on getting worse, even though they kept busting open new holes. Now, the city had almost was booming in the 1950s. It had, in the post-war boom, it went from about 1.5 million people in 1940 to 3 million people in 1950. Things seemed really good. And the reason why it was growing so much, and this is an important point, is that the Mexican government was actually very intent on urbanization and industrialization. They wanted to make Mexico City an industrial center for the world. And they put all of their eggs pretty much in the basket of Mexico City. They did some investments other places, but the disproportionate investment was in Mexico City. So it wasn't that Mexico City had a great climate that people were coming to. I mean, it has a nice climate, it's pretty temperate. But the reason why people were coming there were jobs, there were resources, there was infrastructure. There were things like these giant canals that I was just talking about. There was water for the most part. Now, to keep up with the demand, the Mexican government started to pump more and more groundwater, which now starts to become a problem. Imagine I come up to the sponges underneath your feet, and I start sucking with a big straw, and you guys will start to sink slowly, because if you imagine a big sponge, when it dries out, it starts to become a little shriveled up, little brick. So what was happening was that the city was actually sinking so much that big canal that I mentioned they built started to tip backwards. They started to make these kind of diagrams showing the difference in the grade. So if you can see here, this is the Grand Canal. This is the city right here. This is a canal going through the land out of the watershed completely. So if you imagine that this is my canal here, it went away from the city. But they would notice that the city was sinking so much that the canal was actually starting to tip towards the city. This is not a situation you want. If you imagine your house, you have a sewer coming away from your toilet, it goes downhill. You don't want the sewer to go the other way. That means your toilet starts to overflow with water and you never get rid of anything. So this is what they were afraid of when they started making these kind of diagrams. And this is what they showed would happen in the case of a big flood, is that actually, if there was enough water that it rained, the lake on the other end of the canal would fill up, and the water would come down a superhighway into the center of the city and cause this kind of horrible inundation right in the center of downtown. So this is downtown San Francisco underwater. Imagine that. This is not what they wanted for the capital of the country. So engineers did two things. Well, actually, hold on. Before we move on, I want to make sure that we understand just how fascinating this is. The irony that the flood protection infrastructure, this giant canal that was built in 1900 to get rid of floods, by 1950 is the way that the city will be flooded. So you have a flood protection infrastructure that is now flooding the city. Now, they didn't really, upsell that point. They kind of downplayed that in their report, but they still tried to get government money, saying, "Look, this is going to happen, so let's build something new." And so what they ended up doing was first moving the wells south. So they had a lot of groundwater pumpings. Imagine you guys right here around the camera, you're the downtown area. So they said, okay, no more wells here. We're going to go. What, you have a question? Okay. So you guys are the downtown area. We said no more wells here because you guys are sinking way too fast, and that's where we want to protect. So we moved the wells to the peripheries, to the south, to the east, and let them subside. That's fine. Not a big deal. So the next thing they did was build a giant tunnel. Now this precedes the tunnel I showed you earlier. This is the first one. This is called Drenaje Profundo, the deep drainage. This was built, it's a 6.5 meter diameter, or 5 to 6.5 meters in diameter. You could drive a giant car through this. It was 70 kilometers long, all in all, these little systems of tunnels. And this is a really big sewer. This is not the sewer that's in our backyards and the main streets. This is humongous. And it was built so deep underground that the idea was, well, there's no way that you can sink far enough that this won't work. Unlike this canal, it's built way underground. It's a last stop. If you imagine playing soccer, you have the goal. This is the goalkeeper. This is the last line of defense. There's nothing else. Now, what did this actual infrastructure do? What did this technology do? It avoided the short-term catastrophe. There was never again a major flood in the center of the city. That's good. That seems like a success. But it also did something else. It vastly increased the amount of water that was bypassing the aquifer completely, because as we talked about earlier, the city grows and more pavement gets put down, and then whereas what you need when you grow the city is you need places for that water to go. If you're going to put pavement down, that means that water is not going to go into your aquifer. That means that you need a place to channel the water when it runs off. Goes down the street, goes into your storm drain. It has to go somewhere. The Drenaje Profundo gave it a place to go. Now so the city could continue to grow, which is again what the Mexican state wanted in this moment, was more growth. Now, that meant that also, though, that water that otherwise would have recharged, would have gone into the aquifer when it filled up those sponges, was actually now just going into a giant tube and going out. So that means something bad. If you're worried about subsidence, if you're worried about the sponges drying up, well, now the sponges are going to drop even faster, at least on the peripheries, but not in the center. So from 1975 to the present, what we see then is this kind of floods in the rich center of the city are no longer as big a deal, but in the peripheries, all of you guys are getting flooded. But it's not the same kind of big flood that we're used to. It's actually, and the reason why it's happening is not because some big canal is breaking, but it's all the little bits and pieces of infrastructure of the city. All your gutters, all your sewers. You built a building. Here was your building before. This is the building right here. And this is a sewer. It goes away from the building, but you're pumping so much water that the building actually starts to sink. And now the sewer goes into your basement. And that's not good. Your basement's full of sewage. This is not a good situation. But it wasn't happening in the center of the city anymore. It wasn't happening all at once. It was happening bit by bit because the whole, if you imagine all these different bits of soil, all these different kinds of sponges, there's different properties, different sponges. It's not all the same brand. And so different parts sink at different rates, and then you end up with, gutters going one way and the other way, and then it's just a mess. And this is something that engineers complain about a lot. Now, what engineers did in this, and totally unintentionally, was to make the concentrated violence of a big flood in the city center into something diffuse, dispersed, spread around the city, spread around in time, so it's not happening all at once, and spread around in space. You get flooded, then you, then you, then you. It's very hard to take a picture of all of you guys together. But if all of you get flooded at once, we get this big, nice picture. Look, it's all flooded. Mexico City's screwed. They can't handle anything. That was not what they wanted to avoid. And did you have a question?
I was wondering if there's socioeconomic division.
Oh, absolutely. So,
center to the periphery.
Yeah. So the periphery in this time was all basically poor migrants coming into the city. The center was. There were certain parts of the center that were also had poor migrants in them, but a lot of other parts were the sort of rich historic buildings of the city. So it depended on where you went. But generally speaking, you could draw a line of sort of a gradient of rich in the center and poor in the periphery. So these kind of, floods don't capture the elite imagination the way the flood in the Central Plaza does. It doesn't cause the same sort of political catastrophe. Just to share a little anecdote that I've learned in my fieldwork, that when the Drenaje Profundo was first opened, it was 3 days before the actual ceremony, the opening ceremony was supposed to happen. The engineer I talked to, he got a call from the president saying, "Open the floodgates." And he said, "But wait, we have a bunch of people inside. We have our equipment. We're not done yet. They're still doing the finishing touches, imagining, removing this and that piece." But the thing is that the State of the Union address was going to happen the next day. And the city was about to be flooded. They saw that the meteorological reports that there was going to be a big storm, and they said, "Okay, we have to do something about this." Open the floodgates, and they pulled everybody out very quickly. But the machines just got washed down. They got washed through the system. They never recovered them. So, the political exigencies of why they built the thing they did is very important to always keep in mind, and just keep in mind in general about technology. That there's often very much a political motivation as much as a technical rationale for how and why things get built. So what I argue, and this is still exploratory research, I'm still developing, this is just kind of beginning of my dissertation, is that these kinds of technologies, this dramatic profundo actually served to delay and make it more difficult to perceive the crisis that was actually happening and the root cause of the crisis, which was sort of uncontrolled urban growth of the center of the city, this disproportionate investment, this disproportionate growth in the center of the city. That the impacts of that became very diffuse and hard to see, and it became very difficult to actually have a debate about what was actually happening, the root cause of it. And in a way, so that crisis was just washed away out of the tunnels of the system. So if the city's going to grow, what are we going to do? We're going to build a big tube and get the water out of it. There were other solutions, there were other options available, but they also had a certain idea of how the city should work. Just like, similar to the Spanish, they thought, it was natural and normal to have a drain. It didn't make sense to try to do something else, put ponds. They did try their things. There were different groups experimenting, but at the end of the day, the decision that got made was the city's going to grow, we're going to build a big tube, because that's what's going to be most effective, cheapest, and biggest. It also gives a source of pride to say you have the biggest tunnel in the world. So now the irony too is that the growth of the city, the fact that this big tube actually allowed the city to continue to grow, meant that it grew over the areas that could have been used later on for a more sustainable kind of flood control, to make recharge areas, to recharge the aquifer. Those opportunities got foreclosed by the design of the system. And so you actually end up with a lasting, concrete impact, literally cementing in place a political paradigm through this kind of tunnel. And that's something that we always have to think about when we adopt the technology. It's sometimes much more of an impact than adopting a law. You can go and reverse a law, strike the books, and some people's lives are affected, but more or less you can reverse things. You can't reverse a tunnel like this very easily. It's such a big investment, and it's totally transformed the landscape that even now today, there's actually the water that goes out of that tunnel is used for irrigation by a bunch of people, and they don't want to change their livelihood. You've completely altered the ecology of the area. So I think the big point is that the biggest unintentional impact, the sort of unintended consequence of the Dramatic Profundo, was not just these floods or these, the aquifer depletion, but it was actually to reinforce the political paradigm in which it was designed. That political paradigm of we're going to grow the city, we're going to grow the center of the city, that actually gets reinforced in concrete by this technology. Now, I think this, drawing on my own case study as well as the sort of work of people like Langdon Winner, some of the scholars that I really appreciate, I think what this tells us about technology in general is that given, all else equal, technology will often tend to reflect the power dynamics in the political paradigm and the cultural norms of the system in which it's designed. And if we're not careful, it's also going to reinforce those and actually further entrench the problems that we're trying to solve. So technologies are political. We have to think about them that way. We have to think about the consequences. We have to be very careful about who's designing for whose interests, why, where, and not take as a given that it's a benevolent process and of sort of march forward and everything's going to work well. And we have to be careful to make sure we're not distracted. They're actually addressing the underlying root cause of the problem and not simply distracting us from it. And the issue is that oftentimes technologies do exactly that they actually make it harder for us to actually address the fundamentally political causes of the problems we're trying to address. And I would argue in most of the issues of sustainability, the root causes are often political. It's Mark Jacobson on this campus has done amazing work to show that we have all the technology we need to have wind, solar, water. We can have sustainable energy in the entire country. Why don't we have it? It's politics. It's not about a lack of technology. Yes, a more efficient solar panel might make that easier, but if we're not careful, if we're not careful, we just might end up using more energy, and then we, just like the city of Mexico, can continue to grow, and then you end up just needing more, and then you have a lithium crisis. These are the sorts of things that you have to think about when you come up with a technology. Its fundamental issue is that, at least in climate change, is that we consume a lot of stuff. We consume way too much. The fundamental issue in Mexico City is that it's too big. Almost anybody you ask, including the engineers, say, well, city's a mess. It's too big. It's going to fall apart. We're doing what we can. But people are aware that the fundamental issue is political, but they're also enmeshed in that political paradigm, and so they're designing for that political paradigm. So, if you ask me, I don't think we can wait around and, for this perfect innovation to solve our environmental crises. I think that we have to do the hard work of organizing politically and to actually change those underlying fundamentally political issues that constrain what we can design, that constrain what our technologies can be applied to. I think that's the hard work, and it's not something that you have to do simply with elected political parties and with this whole mess that we have today. I mean, I don't know what your opinion is of it, but it seems pretty broken to me. But there's a lot of movements on campus and around the world that are fighting to make a different paradigm. There's people here I know from fossil-free Stanford, from people who are actually trying to get the university to divest from fossil fuels to make a different paradigm. There are people in Mexico City also struggling to get a new kind of a constitutional right to water, a new way of thinking about water, a new paradigm of designing it, but it ultimately becomes a long, slow struggle. Just like the struggle to innovate. The struggle to innovate politically is also long and hard, but it is also definitely, in my opinion, one of the key reasons we actually have the ability to design these technologies is, all of these struggles in the 1960s actually made it such that the environment was an issue. We had laws that required people to design. The whole reason I had a job in doing environmental remediation was that there was a Clean Water Act passed in the 1970s that required, companies to clean up after that. They didn't want to do that. There was no way they were going to do that otherwise. And in a lot of countries, they don't do that at all because they don't have those political norms. So I think that what I want to do now is open this up for questions, absolutely, and to talk about some of the technologies and issues that you guys care about, and what we can actually work through. What are some of the unintended consequences? What are the things that you've heard about, and what do you want to debate? So I'll open it up for questions. I think you wanted to start.
Okay, so I had a question when you were talking about how a lot of the technology is already there, but a lot of the constraints are political. Do you think that the media and just the culture in our country portrays a false idea that it's the technology that's lacking rather than the political structure in order to institute these measures for sustainable energy?
Well, I think that the media definitely, there is a general push for saying that technology is the problem, but why do you guys think, I'm going to pose the question back to you, why do you think the media would show that?
I think for one thing, I think it's easier and more just optimistic, because there's a big push for technology and innovation for our country to be a leader in it. So it's a lot easier to just say we need to develop more technology than to address why certain technological growth in these fields are being stunted by politics. That's a lot more of a delicate and complicated issue than just saying, let's invest in technology.
Well, nobody loses when you say, we're going to invest in technology. Everybody says, okay, I can keep doing exactly what I've been doing, no problem. The sort of classic example is, we have a pretty, unfortunately, if you look at the Mexico City, for example, there's finite resources. It's a finite space, finite amount of water, unless you want to bring it from the sea, but if you think about the globe, there's sort of finite number of resources. But if you can say that, with technology, we'll keep innovating, keep creating new things, we'll go to Mars and Elon Musk will bring us new minerals, then you don't have to worry about redistributing the pie because the pie just keeps getting bigger. But if you actually say, well, hold on, we've got something actually finite to deal with, we have a finite carbon budget, then we have to start redistributing who gets to use what. And that's a much more difficult and touchy political question, but that's ultimately what we're actually after. So I think that it's, given the media is controlled by 5 corporations for the most part, I think they have a pretty vested interest in often showing a certain side of what's possible and not touching on something so controversial like that. So that's my personal take. Yeah.
Are there any technologies or aspects of our infrastructure that you, personally, in your opinion, see now as being our sort of giant tunnel that will sort of harm us in the future, but now engineers are really pushing? Do you have any specific?
I have one, but what do you guys think? Is there one that you think of? What's our giant tunnel that's haunting us? Fracking, maybe, yeah. If we contaminate deep aquifers.
Not just that, it's releasing methane into the air right now.
Yeah.
Dams,
yeah. We're actually actively dismantling dams because we screwed up the whole fish habitat. This is a problem, and it's silted up, and now everything's evaporating. One that I would suggest too, and I think about a lot, is our highway system. The entire urban planning, is, you think about the electric car, and this is sort of an example of sort of another technology. Elon Musk and these people are doing amazing work to make electric cars. okay, so when J.D. Straubel, who was one of his vice presidents or something, came to campus to talk about it, I asked him, well, what about the rebound effect? What about, your rebound effect being basically that if you create something that's more efficient, and it's cheaper, people tend to just use more of it. I just bought a Prius. Unfortunately, I realized that I would live in the Bay Area, and I'm kind of screwed, and I sometimes have to get places very quickly, and I need a car. And now, why do I need a car? Because of this massive urban jungle we've designed. And the fact that they put Stanford in the middle of a giant suburban jungle. I mean, and I don't want to live there because it's too affordable and too unaffordable, so I have to live somewhere else. And I asked him about that, and I also asked him about, well, what's your relationship, with public transit? Don't you have a vested interest as an electric car company in actually derailing public transit? And he said, those are questions for philosophers. And I'll never forget that. That was just a quote in my mind, but those are not questions for philosophers. Those are questions for all of us to deal with, and especially the people who are designing them. So, other questions, yeah.
What social factors do you think are preventing people from living more sustainably, and what social factors do you think would change that and make people want to live more sustainably?
The question is about why, what are the barriers for people to want to live more sustainably, or what are the barriers for people who want to live sustainably to do so? They're kind of two different questions. Okay, I think the easier one that I can speak to more of, people who want to live sustainably but can't. I think a lot of it is actually things like infrastructure. I mean, if I remember my civil engineering, one of my civil engineering classes, it was sort of the basically materials. It was like we were learning all about concrete and steel and all these other kinds of things. I don't remember most of the class because I kind of tuned out for half of it, but there was one slide that I'll never forget, which was the amount of per capita consumption of concrete, steel, asphalt, pebbles. I mean, look, it was like, imagine if you every year were carrying around like this, like an ancient Egyptian slave, like giant blocks of steel, and that is the amount of per capita consumption of these materials that we don't even see. It's not like we go out to the store and buy, I would like my lump of steel for the year. It's that we go to Stanford and we keep on building new buildings. Do we need new buildings? I don't think so, but they keep on building them because that's good for GDP. And then that means that we each have a little share of those buildings that we actually have to carry around. And so it means that no matter what you do and I do, if we become a vegetarian, we don't drive, we bike, we never fly, you still end up consuming, 3 planets, the per capita equivalent. I mean, there's almost no way for an American to get lower than that. And that's, it's because we're locked in, we're baked into these tunnels, we're baked into these infrastructures, and we have to change those, and we can't keep building new ones. I mean, when I went to Texas and I saw they were still building McMansions of 4,000 square feet with swimming pools 50 miles from Dallas, and I said, what the hell is going on? Why? This is the 21st century, but they're still building them, and that's a house that's going to last 50, 60 years. And someone's going to live there for 50, 60 years unless it becomes totally unaffordable for them to do so. Another question, yeah.
I guess you kind of touched on this, but do you see like solar panels and wind turbines and all that as kind of like our big tunnel right now? Like, I feel like under the situation with like climate change, when we have like run into some time pressure to like get off of fossil fuels as fast as we can, like, are we just jumping too quickly down a path that could like shoot us in the butt later, or I think it's necessary, but
No, I mean, I think that's a good question. I personally don't think they're a big tunnel. I think it's I'm glad that those exist. If those didn't exist, we wouldn't even have an alternative at the moment. But I think that...
Well, versus like consuming less, like just radically changing which would be obviously one of the barriers, but... I
think that the takeaway is that we have to do both always all together. And it's something that you can't just let the technologists run off, because, if they make if the pace of computer development continues, and we're going to be each holding little like super nano computers that consume like massive amounts of energy. I mean, it's not going to be. I don't know if that's going to be the biggest thing. But we're going to have hover cars. Elon Musk wants to make a hyperloop. I mean, I love Elon Musk. I mean, he's a really interesting person, but he has some crazy ideas. We want to colonize Mars. I mean, so imagine all of us working to colonize, to create the jet fuel to colonize Mars, and we all have to run off. We're going to end up taking up all of that energy unless we do both. If we have both, we can do. If we have political control, then we can actually drive that technological innovation and keep a cap. You say, well, okay, we have a carbon budget. This is what we're going to deal with. But if you say that there is no carbon budget and we can keep going forever, then we'll just eat it up. I mean, for the most part. I'm not an expert in solar panels, so I would defer to somebody like Mark Jacobson. But I think that's my personal take. So, yeah.
So one of the sustainability in general is not an area that I am very well informed in. That's kind of why I came, just because I think it's interesting. But
Yeah.
One of the things I think is most interesting regarding sustainability and environmental studies, et cetera, is sort of the economic side of that, and how you sort of what you touched on as far as these constructs we have in terms of urban planning and this very ingrained world we live in which much of it is unsustainable. But I think there is a very real and seemingly underrepresented aspect of the conversation of how do we address these problems with a pragmatic perspective on our current economy and the way that these things can actually work with an economy that can continue to be prosperous for everybody involved. So I think my question is where do you meet in the middle as far as sure, we have the technology to go all renewable energy in 20 years. But economically, is that feasible? Can we employ people doing that? Can we? You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
where do you how do you mitigate that, but also achieve the goals of progressing towards the ideal of sustainability? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I guess if I understand, you're kind of saying, how can we afford to do these things?
Right.
Well, I think that it's not as difficult as we like to think. I mean, when I don't know the current number, but we just gave, for example, Israel $40 billion in arms. I mean, that how many solar panels could you buy for that? I mean, instead of missiles. I mean, it's not the amount of money that the government spends and has, and the amount of money that the top 1% of the population has is more than enough. I mean, we could, if you actually said, okay, we're going to rationally use the productive labor of all of our citizens, you could do a lot of things. I mean, but if you're going to spend most of our time, having people work to make little gadgets, I mean, that nobody's going to use, and people are going to throw away in 2 years. I mean, how much of your life is, our collective labor is spent developing garbage? I mean, that's productive energy, that's productive time that we could use differently. But in this current system that we have with capitalism, that's not the way things generally go, and especially with kind of unregulated capitalism, where we say, well, if you make money, it's okay. If you can put a carbon budget, if you can put these sorts of things, and then the market can do a lot of good work. But left to its own devices, the way we have, no, a lot of these things aren't affordable. But we've made amazing progress. I mean, I think the fact that the solar panel is almost at parity and all these other kinds of things is really a remarkable testament to the work of a lot of innovators. So I mean, those things are possible, but is it going to get rid of the problem in and of itself? No, I think there's going to have to be a big political shift.
But I mean, I think what I hear is that you are really calling for a extremely fundamental shift in every aspect of our culture and government. I mean, honestly,
Yeah.
that's I'm not putting a good or bad spin on that.
Yeah.
But that's not realistic. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In the sense of very real sit down and let's solve the problem. So where do you know what I mean? In a capitalist world where money is not distributed justly and work is not distributed justly, where do you make tangible progress towards really fundamentally trying to become a sustainable society despite those obstacles?
I think we're running out of time.
No, we're good.
Oh, we're good? Okay. Okay. So, no, I mean, it's a really big question, but I think that, it is definitely not all at once. I don't believe that somebody's going to sweep. I don't want somebody to sweep. I just saw a play about, it can't happen here at Berkeley, about sort of a demagogue sweeping into power, and, that's not the solution. That's not the way we're going to come about these things. But I think that if you look at the way any social changes happen, and how did we end up with the 8-hour workday? How did we end up with, the Clean Water Act? How did we end up with most of these things? How did we end up with the Civil Rights Movement? It was not, it didn't happen overnight. It's a lot of work of a lot of different people, and it's slow. It's never going to be perfect. I mean, the idea is we're probably not going to get to it. We're probably going to bake ourselves. We're probably going to be at 4 degrees Celsius. I mean, we're probably going to be at all these things. But if we don't aim for a way lower, we're never going to even get to the halfway there. And so I think it's a matter of aiming for the moon and landing, or aiming for the stars and landing on the moon, something like that, and working for concrete, finite goals, not starting out with saying, okay, we're going to do everything at once. We're going to say, well, we don't want to build a new Dakota Access Pipeline. Let's stop that. This is not what we need for our future. And you start with those winnable things that people can actually get behind and get excited about.
Right.
And I think that they have to feel like they're going somewhere. You can't take on the entire fossil fuel industry at once, but you could say, well, we at Stanford are going to divest from it because we don't think that's the future. And that makes a step. And then you go out and you do, it's bit by bit. It's not all at once.
So I don't